Well, morning everybody, and firstly, thank you, Darren and the team. Really pleased to be joining you today, and just kind of congratulations on getting the Expo up and running and everything kind of happening. Great to see a fantastic program, and really pleased to be here to kind of share thoughts on where what's happening in terms of COP26, where things are at the moment, and hopefully give you an insight into things you should be looking out for as the negotiations and the conference kind of comes looming into sharp relief, starting in the beginning of November. Next slide, please, Chris. So I thought it was worth having a quick look and a reminder of key aspects of the Paris Agreement, because a lot of what's going to be happening in terms of COP26 is contingent on and is taking forward some of the key parts of the Paris Agreement, and therefore kind of just being familiar with those is a useful reminder. Next slide, please. And I think this first bullet point is absolutely crucial. And it's one that actually I think, in the shorthand of people talking about the Paris Agreement, they tend to get wrong. So firstly, what was Paris all about? Well, it's about holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C, and to pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. Now, the reason I say, people often get this wrong, because people say 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees if we can. Well, Paris, 2 degrees isn't well below 2 degrees. So I kind of just want to put that out there, that anybody who thinks that we should be aiming for 2 degrees is not consistent with the Paris Agreement. So we're looking at well below 2 degrees as the target, and really that needs to be 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that's what we should be aiming for and shooting at, and putting everything into getting there. So that's kind of that first bit. The second part is that the Paris Agreement also recognises that climate is changing, and we're already, locked into a changing climate from greenhouse gas emissions, which are already now in the atmosphere and will continue to be kind of pumped in over the next, decade, and etc. And so the ability to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change and foster climate resilience. And interesting here, the link to food production. So recognizing that it's really important in tackling climate change that we still need to be able to feed a global population, and bear in mind that the global population now is about 7.8 billion people, and we're expecting, or the projections from the United Nations are for another about 2 billion people on the planet between now and 2050. So kind of that food production is going to be really important in that context. But nevertheless, whether it's smaller island states, which are incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise, whether it's droughts, which are going to affect an extreme heat, which will affect many locations in the world, whether it's bigger storms, all of that is really important to be aware of. And kind of just worth mentioning here, UK is one of the leaders in being able to understand the risks of a changing climate at a national level. So kind of a quick shout out that the government will be publishing its updated climate change risk assessment, the third one that it will have done later this month. So kind of look out for that, and that will tell us what are the major risks here in the UK, but also what are the issues kind of other countries are going to be facing as well. And the third point here is around making sure that finance flows towards low GHG emissions and climate resilient development, particularly to developing countries, and those countries which are going to be severely affected by a changing climate, when those countries haven't contributed significantly to the temperature rises from human-induced activity that we are going to experience. So that equity aspect is a core thing. So those are the kind of the three headlines in the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. And, you know, in terms of what that means, well, each country has what's called a nationally determined contribution, which is there to represent their best efforts towards reducing greenhouse gases. So that's something which you might have come across, nationally determined contribution, NDCs. What is it that each country is committed to do to ensure that on a global basis, we get to 1.5 degrees maximum warming compared to pre-industrial levels. So that's one of those things. The other is that in terms of stabilizing the climate, it's absolutely critical that global emissions peak as soon as possible, and then we kind of need to get them down. There is what's called a ratchet mechanism to tighten and strengthen NDCs and change and enhance ambition over time. And I'll give you some examples of where that's happening now. So, 6 years on from the Paris Agreement, then this tightening and ratchet mechanism is underway. So you will, and we'll kind of look at some of the commitments that are being made by some of the major emitters. Fourthly, there's a rule book. So, a lot of the actions on climate change, when they have to be shared across different countries, then what you need is a set of kind of rules and aspects, so you understand that everybody is, when they say they're going to do something, they're going to do something then, or if they're kind of moving forward in the right type of way. So the rule book has aspects on national monitoring, reporting and verification, so an MRV aspects, so that countries can be held to account. There's also, under Article 6, which is one of the most contentious parts, or not, when I say contentious, one of the most difficult to kind of draft, has been around trading mechanisms under Article 6. So how do you start to put a carbon price or a price on carbon emissions? And are you able to link schemes and initiatives between countries so that you can start to kind of find the quickest and most effective ways of reducing emissions? Now, when the Paris Agreement was kind of first formed, this rulebook wasn't all in play. It still hasn't been finalised yet, and Article 6 is something which needs to be bottomed out, and we need to get that into play. And then finally, within the Paris Agreement, there is this global stock take every 5 years. So we're in the start of the next period of that global stock take. So, and that will run through and conclude in 2023. So that will be a status report on ultimately where are we in that drive to ensure that our emissions peak, and also that we're on track to towards 1.5 degrees warming maximum. So that's kind of in a nutshell the Paris Agreement. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So what are the priorities that have been set for COP26? These priorities sit in 4 key areas. So the first one is securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping to 1.5 degrees, so keeping that within reach. And within that, there are 4 critical areas. So one is about accelerating the phase out of coal, and if you look at where the UK has had most impact in reducing our emissions, and bear in mind that between since 1990 as the base year and 2020, UK emissions have broadly, or maybe not quite, but broadly halved. So we're kind of 50% to where we need to be in terms of net zero. A significant amount of that activity, of our achievement, has been through accelerating the phase out of coal and replacing that largely with renewables, but also a little bit more gas, which will be kind of next on the list to phase out. Secondly, it's about curtailing deforestation. So, our carbon sinks need to be protected from a climate change perspective, but also from a temperature regulation perspective, and also, critical as well in terms of biodiversity loss. So big issues there, and how you do that. Thirdly, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles. I think, we've seen, the whole of the automotive sector is now in a race to transition away from fossil fuel based power into electric vehicles. And, it's interesting to see now kind of lifetime ownership costs of a car over, say, 3 years, 4 years. Well, it's kind of not lifetime, but the total cost of an electric vehicle over 4 years can be the same or now lower than a fossil fuel vehicle. And with the amount of R&D and innovation that's going into that whole thing, particularly around battery technology, then expect that to accelerate. And therefore, we're probably kind of in the lower reaches of an S curve in terms of the take-off of electric vehicles. So that's interesting. And then, more investment in renewables. And I think what was very interesting over the last few weeks was the International Energy Authority's net zero trajectories and recognizing that renewables and the cost of renewables and their effectiveness are going to play a huge role in this transition. So that's kind of the first bit. And I think, probably the UK government will be really pushing that first one, accelerating the phase out of coal. I think that will be a really big part of what it pushes, but we shouldn't forget these other things and their kind of priorities. Second part is about adaptation in terms of communities and natural habitats. So, action to protect and restore ecosystems. The really interesting work that was published earlier this year, the Gupta review into the economics of biodiversity and ecosystems, really important in this regard. And we do have the International Convention on Biodiversity, COP15, coming up this year as well. So expect to see kind of quite a lot about, how do we protect and restore ecosystems? How do we get nature-based solutions to helping to tackle climate change, but also to enhancing biodiversity? That's a lot of activity in there. And then thinking about, what do we need to do to just, build defences around flooding, sea level rise? What does resilient infrastructure look like? How are we going to kind of tackle agriculture, etc., etc.? So kind of a lot about adaptation. Mobilising finance. So, are we going to get what was committed to when the Paris Agreement was signed, this $100 billion US a year climate finance moving from Western affluent countries to those who are developing, which also have significant effects of climate change? So kind of that is, making sure that we stick to that. And then there's work to finalise the Paris Rulebook and just make sure this collaboration between government, business and civil society is working well. So that's kind of what the priorities are in terms of the COP, which the UK, in partnership with Italy, kind of, and it does feel very much that Italy is not kind of part of this, but it is a joint COP between the UK and Italy in terms of hosting this. So kind of a reminder about that. But this is kind of the agenda that's been set to try and hammer out agreements when delegations come together. And there's a lot of work being done in the run-up to COP to ensure that this is going to be successful. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to take a little moment to look at where ambition is starting to be enhanced and what that might mean in terms of where we need to get to. Next slide, please. So, some big announcements from big emitters have been made quite recently. So I mentioned earlier about this ratchet mechanism and enhancing nationally determined contributions. So the UK has come forward with its 6th carbon budget. So that's the first carbon budget to be aligned to a 2050 net zero target. So our 78% emissions reduction for that period 2033 to 2037 compared with 1990. So that's what the UK has done. So we've enhanced our ambition and that's good to see. The US has recently committed to halving its emissions by 2030 compared to 2005, which is also good to see. China has committed to its emissions peaking by 2025 and net zero by 2060. The EU has put in play a 55% emissions reduction by 2030 compared to 1990, and Japan 46% emissions reduction on the same time period. Now, it's worth just noting that that different countries have got different either starting dates, so 1990 or 2005 for the US, and also they've got different end dates as well. So comparing these, but the key point here is that there is an increasing ambition at national level from major emitters, not all of the major emitters, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But I think this is really, well, first of all, it's good to see because it needs to happen. But also when you start to look at what the consequences of this are, then it starts to put, that Paris goal within reach, which maybe, a few years ago, we might not have thought that that was going to be likely. And just coming back to this point about, one of the things was phasing out coal, the G7 in its recent kind of conclusions from the summit held down in Cornwall a couple of weeks ago, agreed to stop the overseas funding of coal to limit global warming. So there is this throttling off of fossil fuels and a prioritization against those which are most significant in terms of climate change, and coal is one of those, but also particularly where there are renewable options which are readily available and affordable. And so kind of interesting to see this transition starting and becoming underway. And next slide, please. So I thought it would be useful. So Climate Action Tracker is a fantastic tool. And when you get my slides, I think on my screen, it's kind of cut off the bottom, but you will be able to see the web link there. So this is kind of starting to map out from the countries that they analyze, and they are the kind of the main ones that are major emitters, either where there has been a stronger nationally determined contribution that actually submitted, one which they are proposing but haven't kind of finally submitted it yet, and some that aren't increasing their ambition. So, we see the UK, US, EU, in particular as kind of big emitters already, United Arab Emirates as well, kind of upping their ambition and submitting into the UN process a stronger target. And once they come through, when they're joined by Canada, China, Japan in particular, South Africa as well, then that will be really encouraging. Those that haven't increased their ambition, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, Australia, I think there will be increasing pressure on those, both from a kind of other countries putting pressure on, but also I suspect, as those who have submitted stronger NDCs will see much more scaled up deployment of alternative to fossil fuel energy sources, and the prices will come down. And I think what was interesting, under Trump, lots of coal power stations were shut down simply because they weren't economically effective. So I would imagine that over time we would see quite a lot of those countries which are haven't increased their ambitions still probably kind of starting to have to make some improvements simply because it's going to be the cost-effective thing to do. So there's a long way to go, but at the moment we've got 46% of global emissions are covered now by a new NDC submission, and that and the race is on to get all countries, or as many as possible, and the maximum amount of emissions covered by a higher ambition. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And so what does this mean? I kind of will walk you through this. So firstly, I'm going to jiggle my cursor and hopefully you can see it moving. So where are we at the moment? 2020, we're about 1.2 degrees warming. So our headroom to move between where we are today and Paris is incredibly small. We have a narrow window or a very kind of limited window of opportunity to get things to where they need to be. Current policies, so those that are already in the mix, get us somewhere between, and kind of the average here is about 2.9 degrees, so just below 3, but it could be almost 4 degrees, which is a significant concern, or down at 2.1 degrees. But within that range, current policies get us to here. The pledges and targets that have been submitted so far get us to within striking distance of 2 degrees, and with if all of the optimistic targets came through, then we could see 2 degrees be broadly in reach. Now that's still not well below 2 degrees, but I think the question is whether we are hopeful that action can be taken and that we can get where we need to be. And actually, I think with a fair wind and a continued focus, particularly in terms of R&D investment, in terms of organising at national level and within nations towards this, then it will be possible to limit warming to 2 degrees or less by 2100. So kind of I'm hoping that's seen as being hopeful. There's an awful lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that everything that we're capable of doing now is deployed to maximum benefit, as well as kind of seeking opportunities to do things more. But I think if we'd have looked a few years ago, this picture wouldn't have been quite as as hopeful as maybe this one looks. So I think on my next slide, it's to say thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, comments, thoughts, if anybody has them. I hope you found that useful. I think COP is a really big opportunity. I think it's great that the UK is hosting it. I think it's great that it's given a sense of purpose. I think a lot of organisations are looking at what does net zero mean for them. So I think from a COP perspective at a national level here in the UK, that is great. There's been a lot of political attention onto it. Key thing is making sure that that is sustained next year and in the years ahead, because that's between now and 2030, a lot of the heavy lifting to really get us on that net zero transition need to be up and running.
Martin, that is fantastic. Thank you very much. There's one question that's just come through, and I've got a couple myself. Eugene has just posted, is there too much focus on hydrogen and carbon storage rather than electrification? Sure.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that is carbon storage really where we need to be driving towards, or is it just an absolute emissions reduction? And I think the first question really, or the first point I would say, is that the focus needs to be forget the word net in net zero. Let's kind of let's put all of our effort into going towards zero. And whether that's a combination of efficiency, new technologies, massive deployment of renewables and the use of electrification has to be a massive part of the answer. And then then we should only be looking at net for those things that absolutely cannot become absolute zero. So that's kind of my first point. The second thing about hydrogen is an interesting one. And I think there are some aspects of hydrogen that I think won't succeed, not because they can't succeed from a technical point of view, but I think it will just be cheaper to run through electrification. So, one of the questions is, will HGVs use hydrogen, or will they be powered by batteries and renewables? I think given the R&D and with a fair wind, my expectation would be that probably batteries will win. And given the efficiency of electrification of transport compared to using renewables or other forms of carbon capture and storage to create hydrogen, to then kind of put that into vehicles as a power source, I just think that the economics of that probably won't work. Interesting one is going to be around heat, I think. So yeah, I think that focus on absolute zero is where things need to be.
Thank you. Martin, this one's actually from me. The average Joe, the person in this country that wants to support the government's ambitions and targets and wants to actually do part of that, it is quite difficult, especially if cost is an issue to you, to put low carbon technologies in. So is there any legislation or funding from government that will do that? So, for example, I've just bought a new house, so why haven't I got solar panels built into my house roof when I buy it? Why haven't I got an EV charger already installed and battery storage? And that way I can do my bit. And it's the old adage, you look after the pennies and the pounds look after yourself. So, but the average person, and perfect example, yesterday we had to talk on EV cars, and they were showing all these very efficient, very cheap leasing, BMWs, Mercedes and all that. I don't want them. I just want a family runaround that get me from A to B, but as cheap as chips. So I can't afford 75 grand or 40 grand for a brand new car, but I like to get a car that I could do. So that kind of support really needs to come from central government. So what is there, or do you know of anything in the pipeline that will help the general public, not just businesses, but the average Joe to help support the targets?
Yeah, really good question, a really important one, I think. So if I start with homes, what's interesting is that in later this month, the Future Homes Task Force will be coming forward with its proposals and recommendations about how the new home sector is going to be kind of go forward to hit not just our net zero targets, but also our all the environmental requirements that are needed from them. So yes, we need our new homes to be generating power, electricity. We need them to be able to charge an electric vehicle. They need to be able to swap electricity back from the car back into the home. They need to be heated in a net zero way. They need to be constructed in a net zero way through the construction process. They need to be kind of net zero in terms of the materials that are used. They need to be biodiversity net gain in the new development. They need to be incredibly efficient in their use of water. They probably need to use blue water in terms of potable sources for drinking, but frankly, we don't need you to use highly treated drinking water to flush the loo, etc. So I think that and they're looking at all of that and saying, how soon can we get all of that together? And it'll be interesting to see what their target date is. But what they've done is they've mapped all the changes that need to happen across all the supply chains to be able to deliver that in terms of homes that are affordable. If you only took this through a single lens of net zero and said, right, okay, houses, we just want them to be powered by heat pumps, for example, and do it by 2023, yeah, you might be able to do it, although I don't think we've got the skills and the people to do it in terms of deploying it. But you would just be supporting the supply chains in either Germany or China. So I think what the government is doing is on what's happening is looking to say, how do we give a reasonable trajectory to be able to get all the whole sector behind this and the supply chains and actually the opportunity to create jobs here in the UK. So kind of watch this space on that one, but I take your point. In terms of if we're going to give people grants to make this, then we're going to have to pay more tax. because we're going to have to find the money from somewhere. So if government is going to fund something, government needs to raise the revenue, and that revenue is largely generated by people anyway, whether it's on VAT, whether it's on income tax, whether it's on national insurance contributions, and all of that. So those are kind of the biggest sources of revenue for the government, and that's what's going to kind of pay for this if that's the route that goes down. The question is, can government set sufficient projects and innovations in place so that the cheapest thing on the market becomes the net zero solution? So you think about what we've done in terms of, in a relatively short space of time, brought the costs of offshore wind down to be now the lowest form of electricity generation. So that's a remarkable achievement from a combination of investment in R&D, innovation, and then scaling up has brought costs right down. How do you do that for homes and people? I think this is absolutely going to be the way for electric vehicles. It might not be today, but I see that Tesla is coming out with a smaller runaround car. I understand that will be electric and that will be more affordable. So I think our net zero ambition is for 2050. There's a lot that is happening now which will drive costs down for consumers. There will be things that you're already doing which you've probably kind of forgotten that you're doing. So you've probably got low energy light bulbs throughout your home. Yeah. Remember when they used to be incandescent tungsten filament ones who were really hot heating up. So we've had a massive transition in lighting, which really supports a huge home-based efficiency in terms of lighting that, there was a lot of squealing at the time, but you don't hear people moaning now. You kind of that. So there are things that happen that consumers are doing. And of course, the energy that you don't use is the cleanest, greenest that can be. So kind of efficiency, efficiency, efficiency.